Thank you, Merritt. And thank you, Marty. I'm David Morgan. I'm the Stewardship Director at Chelan-Douglas Land Trust. And I would like to emphasize a couple of big themes. One is how important partnerships are for a land trust like the Chelan-Douglas Land Trust. And the second one is how, when you are a land trust, and if you actually own the property completely, which is a little different than the examples that Marty was focusing on, you may have more decision space. You may be able to do more ambitious projects. I'd like to share some examples of those with you later. Please go to the next slide. So the Chelan-Douglas Land Trust is almost 40 years old. We're based in Wenatchee. We protect or have protected, let's say, 4 different categories of lands, and I'm going to focus on that number 4, fee simple or fee title. That means you own all of the rights associated with the property. The due diligence and the process to work with or acquire fee simple properties is very similar to what Marty described, but the key difference is that there is no other landowner involved. You, as the land trust, will own that property, just like you might own a house after you've paid off the mortgage. You are totally responsible for all of the decisions related to it. Like a lot of land trusts and nonprofits, our staff is small. We seem to add new properties every year, which is both great and a challenge for the stewardship staff. So we really need partners to help us get the work done. Please go to the next slide. Fee simple, fee title means the same thing. Marty described it's actually a fairly complicated process in the background before you can acquire a property, whether it's an easement or a fee title property. We also need grant funding. We don't have money to do this typically on our own. There are deed restrictions, a lot like Marty described. Some of them are related to the funder's intentions, say the Recreation Conservation Office. If they support acquisition of a property for salmon habitat protection, of course, we forever need to make sure that we're not doing things to impair that habitat. The property is permanently restricted in the same way that Marty was describing. The third bullet there, the reason I highlighted it is something that I think is especially important, at least in our area, in the Wenatchee area. We have encountered from numerous funders who are generous and supportive of the work we do, but they prefer not to work with conservation easements. Sometimes they feel that having that other landowner involved will complicate follow-on restoration work. And frankly, sometimes they don't even buy the argument that buying a property and protecting it forever is inherently good. They feel like it's just maintaining the status quo, say for salmon habitat. They really like it when we have, sorry if I'm having audio issues, I don't know what I can do about it. When we acquire a property, we will try to emphasize to the funders the possibilities that we can improve the habitat. And that's one of the ways that the partnerships are critical. Please go to the next slide. There's numerous ways the partnership model can work. This is sort of an idealized, simplified version. We will often, let's say, dream up a habitat improvement project before we even acquire a property. We may notice from aerial photos or just familiarity with the area, we see a property when it floods, or we see a house that's located in a floodplain, and wonder if those things weren't there, how we could improve the habitat. If there are technical analyses, like maybe the Bureau of Reclamation has done a reach analysis or something like that, they will often point in very high level ways to potentials or ranked potentials for acquisition or restoration priorities in an area. We try to identify the right partners for the job. We're pretty lucky in the Wenatchee area. There are several talented organizations that I'll mention later that we rely on heavily. They all have certain strengths, and we like to have lots of different partners for lots of different projects. And of course, that includes support from the agencies in terms of either permitting or getting the funding in the first place. Please go to the next slide. The most important thing on this slide, and maybe one of the most important things in my job, is all the way at the bottom. Nobody has all the answers. No organization can do it all. Developing relationships and maintaining them are the key to, I feel, our success, at least in stewardship at Chelan-Douglas Land Trust. We've got a great staff, we're talented, but we're small, and there's only so much we can do on our own. The bullets there are things that we have done at times on our own, but they are not our strong suit. They're not really where we want to emphasize our limited staff capacity. They're not the core of our mission to connect people with nature and protect open spaces. The last bullet, though, I would like to emphasize that one, and that's another one where when you own a property in fee title ownership, as opposed to, say, a conservation easement where there is another landowner, or pardon, not another landowner, the landowner still has rights. With a property like a fee title property, we have more flexibility to add other elements to riparian restoration, such as environmental ed, indigenous themes, cultural diversity, climate change, and other things like that. Please go to the next slide. This is a picture of one of our properties in the Middle Entiat River watershed. Believe it or not, just before this picture was taken, there was a 3,000 square foot house and a bunch of outbuildings, more or less right in the middle of the picture. The Land Trust owns about 5 miles of riverfront in this area. This is just one, it was a 16-acre parcel. And when the house was there, we heard stories about occasionally rowing over to it. There was obviously a great deal of fill that had been brought in 20 years ago when the house was built. Wetlands and side channels were filled in. And since we knew we were going to be partnering on some other nearby properties on fish habitat restoration, we approached the landowner and said, could we buy your property? Because we recognize the high value for fish habitat restoration. Please go to the next slide. And fortunately, the people that owned the property had a relative that worked in the salmon industry in Alaska. And his first reaction was, yeah, I can see the rivers trying to take this house. We never should have had it there. So to make a long story short, before any plants went in the ground, before there was any real riparian restoration, we worked with many partners to take apart a piece of this large house. The part that fit on the truck, you can see here, it went down valley a couple of miles. We gave it away to a family that needed a home on a parcel that was away from the river. Go to the next slide, please. I realize this picture is hard to figure all the details, but hopefully you can recognize, although we're looking at the property that you just saw a minute ago from the other angle, the flow here is a little bit lower. The house used to be smack in the middle of that light gray area. This is shortly after the initial phase of restoration was done, before the plantings really took root, but you can probably see the root wads and other things there. And maybe in the lower right-hand corner, you can see the logos of some of our partners, just to emphasize how much we need partners to get this work done. Yes, the house was repurposed and not torn down. There's people living in it now. And then hopefully on the slide, you can also see it's bilingual. In our area, it's an increasing priority for the Land Trust to engage with the Latino community. Latinos make up more than 1/3 of the greater Wenatchee area. So this is one of our new initiatives. All of our riparian projects will include signage like this in the future. Go to the next slide, please. So here's another property nearby, a mile or so upstream from that house. We acquired this one 20 years ago. We were waiting for the right opportunity to do ambitious fish habitat restoration. We inherited an old bridge. It was in danger of falling in the river while we were in the process of getting it out with a really expensive crane sitting there. The bridge shifted, and among other important partnerships I want to emphasize are your relationships with the regulatory folks. They have responsibilities, you have responsibilities, say, to comply with the HPA Act requirements. And to make a long story short here, some unanticipated things happened when we were dismantling the bridge, which we needed to do before the riparian work could happen. And it was great that we had a good relationship with WDFW and the Corps of Engineers, and in this case, Chelan County Natural Resource Department did an amazing job coordinating among all of the different partners to make sure we stayed in compliance with our permits. Go to the next slide, please. Here we are also in the Entiat River Valley, a little bit upstream now of that bridge. Like I said, we own about 5 miles of the river. And on this property, there was a levee, well over 1,000 feet of levee, obviously preventing the river from going where it wanted to go, where it had been as recently as the 1970s there on the left side. Go to the next slide, please. And here we are after the levee was removed. You may see an engineered log jam there on River Right. I'm not going to talk much about it other than there are more than 100 of these on or next to the land trust properties in this area. Well over 1,000 logs. The county did an amazing job of coordinating the helicopters and ground-based equipment so that the land trust doesn't really have expertise in that, could focus on other things. And we had a lot of great partners to install more than 30,000 riparian plants. We had Ramos, we had Wildlands, we had LKE, we got plants from Derby Canyon Natives, from Plants of the Wild. The county did a great job overseeing all that work. So again, I'd just like to emphasize how with our partnerships here, we were able to do a really large, ambitious project. The time frame here for this particular property, these are about 1 year apart. The property with the house earlier was about 2 years apart. Go to the next slide, please. Now we've moved to a different property, a different watershed. We're on the lower Wenatchee River now. This is the lower Sleepy Hollow property. This is an old barn that's in the process of being carefully taken apart so that it can be reassembled somewhere else far from the river. During the 90s, this barn was almost washed away. Some other buildings next to it were destroyed. The land trust didn't own the property at the time. But we do now and want to restore what are some really weedy meadows, which the river will reclaim one day when it meanders back across the floodplain. So we found some partners here to dismantle this old barn. It was built in the 20s. It's going to go back up and look a lot like it did originally on a new property far from the river where it's never going to get destroyed by a flood. Go to the next slide, please. And this is a property where Cascade Fisheries is doing some amazing work for or on behalf of the land trust and the community near Wenatchee. They've gotten a lot of funding from the Department of Ecology. These piles of mulch are all basically on the spot where that barn used to be. And here are our volunteers. The season after the barn was removed, starting phase 1 of riparian planting. Go to the next slide, please. Here's the same area looking from a different direction. With the benefit of irrigation, the plants are growing quite quickly. I forgot to mention, by the way, in those NTAD examples, support we've gotten from Ecology for some temporary water rights. This property actually has irrigation water, but the riparian places in the NTAD did not. So it was terrific to work with Ecology. There was some process involved, but it will greatly facilitate our restoration goals to have that water for 3 years. Go to the next slide, please. Here's another example of one of our signs. This property at Sleepy Hollow near Wenatchee is very close to town, very accessible to local schools. Schools come to land trust properties in the foothills in the Wenatchee area frequently for education purposes, but most of all of those are shrub step habitat and steep. Students learn different lessons, of course, along a river. So here's an example of a bilingual sign. There will be many of these. Cascade Fisheries and others have done a great job helping. There's been some funding from Ecology. This is another example of one of our bilingual signs that we'll be using at Sleepy Hollow and all of our future projects like these. We appreciate our partners' help here, including Mettown Natives with some other signs related to indigenous uses of the property, which is also influencing the kinds of plants we are returning to the landscape there. Go to the next slide, please. Now we're skipping all the way over into Douglas County. Land Trust also has quite a lot of shrub step habitat. Riparian areas, of course, are really varied, totally different than the places that support salmon. Here we're in the headwaters of Deep Creek, which flows into Foster Creek and eventually the Columbia River. Salmon don't get anywhere near here, but this landscape or these riparian areas on this kind of landscape really are oases. And after a huge fire that covered 400,000 or so acres, 400,000 acres surrounding our 1,500 or so, part of our restoration efforts focused on the riparian corridors. Pretty much everything above ground was killed. This picture is taken 6-ish months after the fire. Go to the next slide, please. This is a different, this is a different riparian area on the same property. Portions of this area were toasted that look similar to that previous slide. A lot of the Russian olive, we hope, died, and with help from several key partners here, like Foster Creek Conservation District, NRCS, BFI, Mettown Natives, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and WDFW, were trying to restore and prioritize certain areas, especially these riparian places. There's quite a lot of browse pressure, whether it's beaver, porcupine, or deer. And we're competing with some native and non-native grasses, so it'll be a challenge, but luckily we have partners to help us figure it out. And if you go to the next slide, again, I just want to emphasize that theme of partnership. And if you are a nonprofit or you're thinking of working with a nonprofit, hopefully I may have given you some ideas today to think in very ambitious ways about what you might be able to do if you can find the right partners to get all the work done.